I've been looking forward to this conversation because we have a terrific lineup. We're going to be talking about, look, it's the big issue, right? I know for those of us in the news business and many of those here at Garma as well, where are we at with constitutional recognition? What's been the road to here as well? And yes, it's been a very long road and at times a very bumpy road. We're not going to traverse all of those bumps in the space of 1 hour, but we are going to touch on some of it, why we are where we are, and what some of the challenges and opportunities are from here as we contemplate the next 2 or 3 months ahead leading up to this very important referendum. Let me introduce who's with us here today, starting with Josie Douglas next to me. Josie is a Wardaman woman based in Alice Springs. At the Central Land Council there, a regional dialogue was held there in Alice. And Josie was involved in that, and she's been involved in the push towards recognition and putting a voice in the Constitution since then. Dean Parkin is a proud Quandamooka man of Minjerribah. He's the director of the Yes Campaign Alliance. Pretty busy right now, and of course aiming to achieve a yes vote in this referendum. Karen Mundine is from the Bandjalung Nation of Northern New South Wales, and she is the CEO of Reconciliation Australia, and brings more than 25 years' experience in community engagement, public advocacy and social campaigns. We also have Chloe Whiten, who's joining us as well, and Chloe is a Wiradjuri Gillirai woman from Gilgandra. She's a board member of Australians for Indigenous Constitutional Recognition. Chloe's also an archaeologist and also a director for cultural heritage at Lend-Lease. And finally, Kenny Bedford is of the Mayrum tribe of the Errabumlay of Darnley Island in the Torres Strait. And Kenny is a member of the Torres Strait Regional Authority, a board director of Reconciliation Australia as well, and a signatory of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming on. Give them a round of applause. Karen, I'm going to start with you because I mentioned I wouldn't mind just getting a bit of a snapshot. We could spend all afternoon talking about the journey towards reconciliation and recognition, in particular in the Constitution, but just give us a bit of a recap how we got to this place.
So I guess anyone that's here knows that this has been a long journey, and this is the idea of constitutional recognition and also a mechanism for representation and voice. It's been part of the reconciliation journey from the beginning. If I just go back, say, 20 odd years, it was one of the final recommendations of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, which is my organisation's predecessor. And I guess it's been bumping around for a really long time. I mean, if I go back further and I think about just growing up in Indigenous affairs, in and around it, these calls have been there and part of every single community organisation, every community meeting I've ever been part of. We can go back to the Barunga Statement, we can go back to the Yirrkala bark petitions, we can go back to the 1938's Aboriginal Progressives Association. These calls for recognition and representation have been there constantly. So it's an aspiration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for millennia, and certainly since colonisation. If we fast forward a few years, we come up to 2012 when there was a hung parliament, I think. Well, certainly there was a need for support from independents in the Senate, and this is where this idea of constitutional recognition resurfaced. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them, but there was a series of parliamentary inquiries, panels, expert panels, lots of consultations with mob, with the general community, but the consensus kept coming back to constitutional recognition and representation. And then if we think back to the Referendum Council, which was kind of, I guess, the last of those processes, setting up these regional dialogues around the country, going out in a constitutional convention style to go to mob to say, what do we want here? There's an opportunity for change. And overwhelmingly through all of those dialogues, so 13 in total, with hundreds of people culminating at Uluru, 250 delegates, overwhelmingly again said, this is what we want. This is how we want to be recognised in the founding document of this nation. This is how we reconcile being First Peoples with the rest of Australia. And we want something that helps us structurally change the positions that we find ourselves in. And that's where the voices come through from. So then, again, a few more inquiries, a few more debates, but here we are.
Here we are, and look, you mentioned, Karen, and thank you for that, you mentioned those dialogues, and Josie, I might ask you about it because, as mentioned, you were involved in one of those regional dialogues. There's been criticism from the No campaign that this particular constitutional change hasn't gone through a constitutional convention process, but as Karen mentioned, was that what the dialogues were?
Well, the dialogues were quite deliberative in terms of each dialogue had 100 people to attend. Land councils were involved, and the makeup of that 100 was traditional owners, native title holders, young people, community members, not just the leadership of organisations. It wanted to be a real grassroots representation of who attended the dialogues. And I think in terms of the No campaign, well, they're not handicapped by the truth, are they, really? So it's hard, it's quite easy to say things if you weren't involved in the process. I was involved in the process. And what came out, and I attended 2 dialogues, one at Ross River, the Central Land Council hosted, and the one in Darwin. And what came out really strongly is that the voice is about self-determination and the voice is about decolonisation. And delegates want something both symbolic and practical that will make a material difference to the lives of people.
Were there other models, other ideas? I mean, I went along, I think, to one of them in Queensland. How strong was the consensus around the sort of model that emerged?
Well, look, if anyone's ever been to a community meeting, and certainly a land council meeting, we have 90 delegates on our council. The debate is fierce. It's not administration or staff presenting ideas and thinking that it's just being rubber stamped. So at the Ross River Dialogue, made up of remote Aboriginal people, there was debate it was held over multiple days. There was fierce debate, and it's a contest of ideas. And there was representatives at that meeting who were very much for sovereignty, very much for treaty. But we also had translators and interpreters. I think we're the only dialogue that did. Language is still very much strong in our region, as it is in the top end. And we had translators for 3 of the main language groups, and it was a very careful process in terms of explaining sometimes quite new concepts. But what people understand is the history, their lived experience and the history of experienced in their lifetime, as well as the history of past generations. And let's not forget that the last massacre in Australia occurred in Central Australia in 1928. So, it's very real lived experience in terms of what the issues are, and there was consensus at the end of the Ross River Dialogue for a voice to Parliament.
Dean, when we finally saw that Uluru statement, the political reaction to it, I just want you to take us back to that moment. Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister at the time, and he immediately, he's changed his position now, but at the time he described that as a third chamber. He dismissed the idea of enshrining a voice in the Constitution. Where did that leave things?
Yeah, it left us in a pretty tough position, David. We'd just come off this process that Karen and Josie have talked about, a historic process. We've never seen a consultation or a dialogue process like this in our history in engaging our mob. And as Josie said, I was a co-facilitator of all of those 13 regional dialogues and the Constitutional Convention. So we have had 14 constitutional conventions on this issue at least. And there was fierce debate. So we did the hard work to come to that. And there were a lot of people that doubted us, as they're doubting us now, as they've doubted us in our history. They doubted that we would be able to come to a common consensus, and so we did. And the spirit of that consensus, the spirit of the invitation that came out of the Uluru Statement was absolutely what we expected it to be, how we expected to be treated when the government was then determining its response. And so when, it was the 26th of October 2017, when the Turnbull Cabinet, well, they didn't even come to the leadership, they leaked it to the newspapers, the idea that they were going to reject the Uluru Statement from the heart. It was a heavy blow. one of the things I learned through that process and continue to learn, particularly from the older people that have been around, is that this happens and you've got to grieve and then you've got to dust yourself off and you've got to go again and again and again. And if anything, firstly, that rejection was proven to be catastrophically wrong. The Australian people knew that it was a very unfair decision. It triggered further processes and examinations, and it absolutely catalysed our determination to campaign for this in a very fierce and determined way, bringing the Australian people along with us. That's why we're here. So we take the lessons from that rejection and say, well, actually, it's resulted in this growing movement of Australians that are getting behind the yes vote.
And at the time, just take us back to that you talked about the impact of the Turnbull Cabinet making that decision. What about the Labor Party? Were they always wholly on board with the idea from your recollection, or did that take a bit of work as well?
Oh, look, there's been different views floating about, and some of the people in the Labor Party are serious senior people who have been examining these issues. Minister Burney, Senator Dodson, Mullendeary, I mean, the list goes on. These guys have been at the forefront of this for a very long time. But once it became very, very clear that there was one position, there's only one form of recognition that means anything to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that is the voice. I actually want to make that point because it has been suggested that we should split the two. Well, we can get recognition over the line and we'll deal with voice separately. It fundamentally misunderstands that the voice is recognition. That is the recognition. You cannot split the two. Recognition doesn't exist without the voice. So once that became very clear, Labor got on board, and obviously you saw the Prime Minister announce that commitment at last year's election.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that, but I need to pick up that point you just raised because it's a powerful one. I think your words were, there is no recognition without the voice. Can I just bounce that around some others here? Kenny, I mean, would you agree? Because we hear from Peter Dutton and others, we should just go for another form of recognition that everyone can agree on. Is that possible?
It became very clear when we talked to our communities over many years, and that was well before the dialogues. There was also a journey to recognition, people may remember, where communities across the country were educated about what the Constitution meant. This came from John Howard. Let's go and ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people how they want to be recognised. So when people understood what the Constitution is, why it was in place, how we were left out of it, it was a clear message from communities that said, this is unfinished business of our elders. We've been seeking this recognition for a long time. Of course we want recognition, but we don't just want symbolic recognition. That's where the voice comes in. We want meaningful recognition, and when we had the dialogues that culminated at Uluru, there was incredibly considered ideas about how that meaningful part of recognition should look. And we've got very smart people in our community who saw that if we're going to the Constitution and we're going to be putting us in there, what is the opportunity while we're amending it? And we've heard about those legislated voices we've had in the past that have been undone so easily by government. So this is where we thought, here's the opportunity for us, while we're going to the Constitution, to recognise us, on top of this being the important recognition as a whole, let's put something in place that guarantees us that voice, which is why we've been so generous about that meaningful recognition, because this is the generous offer again that we're making to all Australians for the benefit of all Australians, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's going to be very important when we have that voice protected in the Constitution. You can bet it will be the most scrutinised advisory body in this country, and that's what we want, because we need to close that gap, and it's not going to get there unless we have this protected voice in full view of all Australians, so that we keep the people who make the decisions accountable, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for all of us.
Chloe, in your view, is there any other type of constitutional recognition beyond the voice?
Look, I think it's important to focus on what's in front of us and remain informed. I suppose there's been a lot of noise out of Canberra and a lot of discussion about other models, and it's worth noting that not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support constitutional recognition, and that's okay. We're a diverse people. I think what's important to remember, though, is that we see the best results when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a say on the issues that impact them the most. And look, I think as Australians, we understand, and we all share a common value, and that is fairness. And we understand that what is happening now in our communities is far from fair. These are the communities that we all come from that want, safe drinking water, in 2023. Look, I'm really confident, and I think that later this year we're all going to come together and back our fellow Australians in securing a yes vote. And what comes next, that's up to the Parliament, that's up to the people. I think now the focus is really on how we can harness the momentum. I mean, the Yes 23 campaign has upwards of 20,000 volunteers now out door knocking, dropping letters off to mailboxes, having conversations, at their churches, at their schools. It's really inspiring to see. And so I suppose, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it can be consuming, but it is also worth acknowledging this isn't a new conversation, and the Indigenous leadership around this has been there and consistent for many, many years. And many of those people that are sitting beside me, but also here, and sadly some of them aren't here to see this. And so I don't take this role lightly at all. It's such a privilege actually to sit here and do this work. And I'm very confident that this year will be a year that we see significant change.
Look, just before we move on, Karen, Josie, I don't know if either of you want to weigh in just on that question, because I do think it is an important one as to whether there is another form of constitutional recognition. This is part of the debate from the No campaign, that a simpler, more symbolic form would be acceptable. Would it?
I think, again, Dean has already kind of answered that in the sense of these are one and the same things. They are not separable. The two sides of the one coin. You can't have one without the other. And this idea of meaningful recognition, I mean, again, the words of Yothi Yindi, words are cheap. We want to see structural change, and this is how you recognise us as First Peoples.
Yeah, Josie.
Just a quick comment on that. I think that question is a case in point. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have very clearly and loudly, through 10 government-led processes over the last decade, have said we want a voice to Parliament, and it needs to be the symbolic recognition as well as substantial material outcomes, substantive. That's what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have said. So it's a case in point where that now is not being listened to, and it's really an attempt to water down what the process, the regional dialogue process, ending with the Constitutional Convention and the ask to the Australian public, because it is to the Australian public, about a voice to Parliament. So I think that's quite symbolic of, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people are really kind of sick and tired of being consulted. We're consulted, we provide our answer, the answer isn't acceptable, and then it's attempted to be changed. So it's about listening, and this is why we need the voice. And it's fantastic that we do have the Albanese government who's committed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and to a voice to Parliament in a referendum this year.
And of course, it was 12 months ago here at Garma that the Prime Minister announced the proposed wording for that constitutional change. He made it clear on the night of his election win that he wanted to get this done, have a vote in this term of Parliament. Dean, just coming back to you, was setting the clock ticking on having a deadline here, essentially, that there is going to be a referendum in this term of Parliament, not just kicking it along and along and along. How important was that? Carries some risk, of course, in setting a time frame for it, but was that essential?
Absolutely. These things can go on and on and on without a resolution. I mean, as we've talked about the history of this, you know, you can start 100 years ago, you can start 30 years ago, you can definitely start the last 12 years. It needed leadership. It needed somebody to stand up and go, we're going to do this. We've done the processes. How many times can you keep going back and asking the same people the same question? It starts to look like you're trying to force a different answer. Well, the answer is, we've just said here collectively, it has been so very clear. Recognition is through the voice. It is unambiguous. There are no other alternatives. And that date needed to be set. It needed to, and yes, there is risk. You can choose not to do that and continue to have the conversation and hope that over time something good might happen. And of course, in a referendum campaign and in a referendum vote where there is a very black and white answer here, that obviously does contain risk. But we see this as the opportunity for this generation in this moment of history, when other generations have been tapped on the shoulder to say, now's your turn to go at it. That is what we are doing here. And we believe the Australian people are absolutely up for it right now.
I mean, to play the devil's advocate here, the risk, of course, is that it goes down, you have a divisive moment, it sets back any constitutional recognition for who knows how long. What do you say to those who would argue if it's looking dodgy, if it's doubtful, it should be pushed back? What would you say to that?
Well, we've been, as I said, doubted and told that this isn't going to happen. We were told that we would never get the recognition agenda up, that we wouldn't achieve Uluru, and we did. We were knocked back very quickly after that, and people told us it was dead in the water, and we didn't accept that answer. We've had subsequent processes that have inched us along, and we've gotten ourselves close. We've now got a provision and a question that are constitutionally very, very safe and appropriate. The best way to change the Constitution, the best way to pose the question to the Australian people. We have a commitment in time. We have growing momentum in the Australian population. I certainly don't take my cues from what's written and commentated upon in the media about what we should do with this, because, quite frankly, they're getting it wrong. And the feedback that we are getting from the campaign, from the ground, from the people that we're door knocking to, the people that we're talking to in the streets, is that there is far more generosity and goodwill and openness to this than much of the broader commentary. So understand that we absolutely believe that a yes vote is possible. And with the trajectory that we're on and the momentum that we're starting to see, we're very excited about the prospects for the vote later on this year.
Let me just bounce that around everyone as well. Does everybody agree that regardless of what the polls might show, we should still press ahead with a vote in October, November?
I would say if people are feeling doubtful, then it's time to dig deep. It's time to get out there, because we're out there and we're seeing the goodwill that Dean speaks of. I think of National Reconciliation Week a couple of months ago. Thousands of people turning out on a windy Canberra morning to hear about the voice and wanting to know more. 2,000 people packing out a breakfast before sunrise, again wanting to hear more. Out on the streets in the hustings. So I would say if people are feeling doubtful, it is time to be an ally and it is time to be part of this, because this is about change and this is how we move forward as a nation.
Did anyone else want to just comment on that question of whether to delay or just to press on?
Yeah, look, I think it's just about being really clear about the facts, and all polls say different things, and I think we really need to be focused on the only poll that matters, and that is on referendum day. this is not about politicians, this is not about politics, this is a conversation for the Australian people, and I am absolutely confident that Australians are ready to back this.
Yep. Kenny?
Yeah. I just quickly, David, I'll add that if that there's no risk to the actual proposition. Let's make that clear. There is some risk, of course, if this is not successful, but that's not good enough to not try. And in the words of the man who's giving us the opportunity, if not now, when? And I think that's, whatever happens, this is a really important point in time where we need to reflect where we are as a nation. This will be a survey of the whole nation on the day of the referendum that's going to say, are we mature? Are we ready to tell the truth? Are we ready to recognise for the very first time the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the ancient cultures, the generosity of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Are we ready to accept this and lay the foundation for, nation building, truth telling, treaty, Makarrata agreement making opportunities?
Do any of you contemplate what sort of profound impact a no vote from the Australian people would have? Where would that leave us? Josie?
Well, we don't like to think about that, but it would be catastrophic in one word.
Why do you say that?
Because we will potentially have a winding back of all the very hard fought for, hard-won rights that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have achieved over many, many generations. Nothing's ever been given to Indigenous people. Everything has been a fight and a struggle. And so, in one word, it would be catastrophic, and we could possibly see the winding back of these important rights. And just another thing in terms of the polls and soft yeses, soft noes, I just want to make this point. A vote no is a vote for the status quo. And there is no soft in-between votes. It's a yes or a no. And if you want things to improve, and I really believe that instinctively Australian people are fair and will vote yes. It's what we're all working towards, but it would be catastrophic.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
It will take us back in terms of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but we're not going anywhere. We're still going to be here. We've been rejected before. We will stand up and we will seek that recognition, and you will know that we're still here.
I guess some of those questions are, the more pessimistic about where this might head. Let me ask some more optimistic questions about what is on the table here. In fact, Kenny, let me come back to you. If the voice does succeed, is put in place, and there'd be a period of legislating it, working out the detail through the Parliament and so on, what do you envisage it doing? What sort of change would it make in your community?
Well, I think it will give people hope to start with, and there's going to be a lot of work that comes after a successful referendum, working out how to make sure that we are putting in place those clearer pathways from local to regional to Canberra and Parliament. But I hope that it will help give people a sense that no matter what the issue in their community, that there's an opportunity to tailor solutions to reflect that particular group. And
so what would it do that you can't do at the moment?
Well, at the moment we've got blanket approaches to everything, and there's a lot of gaps there that aren't being attended to, and people want to be able to say, well, this is the priority for us, make their own local 10-year plan, if you like, and put their priorities into place, work on their solutions, and be able to have that occur in a way that's supported from the very top of Parliament through the various governments and service providers.
And Josie, from a central land council point of view?
Well, let's talk about water in remote communities across Australia. Let's talk about Walgett the water in Walgett and the high percentage of salt there and the impact on health. Let's talk about Kirakura, where they're receiving in boxes of water for the community. Let's talk about Laramba, again, a small community that survived on local government providing pallets of boxed water for many years. So that would be, I think, a starting point, is safe drinking water for remote communities, not just in the Northern Territory, but in other jurisdictions. That would make a real practical difference for people on the ground, for their health, for starters. Let's talk about water in terms of remote dialysis. We know that to provide chairs on remote communities for dialysis, you need a good supply of water. And you need that water to be purified. Let's talk about water in terms of remote housing. No new houses can be built in some of our remote communities because you can't have any new water points. And that goes to the quantity of water available, but also the quality. So a voice to Parliament, a simple thing most Australians take for granted. You turn on the tap, you have clean, safe drinking water. Well, in remote communities across Australia, this is not the case. So let's start with water.
And the role of the voice, just explain how you would see the ability of the voice to advocate for those sorts of things. The water example is a really good one. Would it have greater influence, do you think, on government and the public debate about delivering some of those benefits?
It could set guidelines for safe drinking water in remote communities.
Highlight that to government and deliver some change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dean?
Yeah, been getting out on the ground and obviously talking to communities across the country. Did a roadshow through the Kimberley recently. And to Josie's point, you've got to understand that how these issues are linked in the complexity of them. People in one community were talking about challenges for their young people that are getting out in the streets at night time, getting into trouble, and they're talking about it from a position of we want to be part of this solution. And then they were also talking about the fact that this community is suffering from an acute shortage of safe housing, reasonable housing. And Josie talks about points like, then you go down a further point and go, well, they can't have the housing there in that community because the water's not right, or the connections aren't right. But the problem has been in these existing ways of dealing with these issues, everybody goes, oh, the youth are on the streets. It's an issue of law and order. We've got to just focus on that. And you go to a lot of these communities, the biggest, the fanciest, the most modern buildings are the courthouses and the police stations. Whereas the housing is in an absolutely atrocious state. Insufficient, overcrowded, unsafe. And what the people there in these communities were saying is that if we fix the housing, the young people on the streets is a symptom of a different problem that they understand, which is actually driving those young people out into the streets. But that complexity is just missing in terms of decision making at the moment with bureaucracies and parliaments around the country that are sometimes more seduced by the easy photo op and the appearance of doing something tough in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Now, our mob, don't get me wrong, we want safe communities. We want our young people to be safe, we want our community members to be safe, but we want the issues to be dealt with at the root, not at that symptomatic bit. And that is the sophistication that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are in these communities can bring and make sure that it is consistently brought to the table to be considered in favour, instead of these knee-jerk solutions that when you see what the Productivity Commission is saying about closing the gap are just simply not working. And as Josie said, even the no case agree with us that the status quo is not good enough. They're just not offering any solutions. So that's why bringing the voices of our people to these complex problems is our absolute best chance of getting to real long-lasting solutions.
Karen, what sort of expectations do you think we should set for the voice? And is there a need to be a little careful here that the suggestion that, you know, all of the different complex problems can be so easily solved?
It's not the silver bullet. It's not the everything will be better the day after. We're just at the first starting point of let's agree that something needs to change and that this is a mechanism for how we get those levers happening. Then it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of hard work, but it gives us hope, as Kenny says. It is rebuilding trust between communities and government and politicians. It's all of those ingredients that builds better relationships, that makes us able to and want to be part of a solution. And I think that's what the opportunity before us is.
And what you just said there about being part of the solution, this comes to this concept of empowering.
Absolutely.
Chloe, how important is that?
It's really important, and I think we all understand and we know that our communities, we have the answers. What we don't have is a mechanism to influence the decision makers, to influence policy and legislation, and that's what this is asking for.
Simple.
Now, Karen, you mentioned earlier the words of Yothu Yindi. There was one very famous song, the word treaty in it. Let's talk about that. And it comes back to the dialogues, and the dialogues didn't just call for a voice, it called for a Makarrata process of agreement making and truth telling. How important are those elements to delivering the Uluru Statement?
Well, they are clearly part of the Uluru Statement, but I guess, again, the point is we are here at a conversation around constitutional recognition. This is the starting point for this conversation, and that's where we need to be focused. This is the question that Australians need to answer. It's not being dissuaded or confused by other issues. These things will happen. As I said, there's so much more work that needs to happen the day after. But right now, the question before us is, do we believe that this is a way for us to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples through a voice? It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and look, Josie, keen for your thoughts on this too. You know, there's obviously an attempt here to scare people off voting for it by raising these issues around treaty and reparations and so on. Nonetheless, this was an important aspect of those Uluru dialogues as well. Just how important and what role would the voice play ultimately in some of these things?
Well, the sequencing of the three things, voice, treaty, truth-telling, is very important. And this point has been made many, many times. You need to start with the voice to Parliament. There needs to be a national representative structure, political representative structure. We don't have that in Australia at the moment. So that is very much the focus. In terms of treaties, there's jurisdictions around Australia engaged in treaty-making processes already. So that's underway. We know that the voice is on the table. We're going to a referendum this year. We would like to know the date. There's a PM here, but I don't think he's going to announce it at Garma.
He's just around the corner, you can hit him up.
No, but actually, look, and we know that treaties do take a long time. And in terms of Aboriginal Territorians, we had the 1988 Barunga Statement, which some of the Yolngu members of Yunupingu's family spoke about this morning. So people, that statement called for a treaty and a national representative body.
That's 35 years ago.
35 years ago, and here we are today, making the same ask, but we're calling it a voice to Parliament. And that has to come first. And at a Central Land Council meeting in discussions, people are well aware that a treaty process will take time, will take decades. It might not happen in their lifetime. You know, our council members are elderly. They've been waiting for change for a very long time. We have a voice, a referendum that we're going into this year. People are, old, they're sick, they're dying. These are our leaders who've been pushing for self-determination, pushing for change over many years. And if we don't get the referendum up this year, in whose lifetime will we have this change in Australia that we need?
Do you have many who support what's being called the progressive no position, that we should vote no and hold out for treaty?
Well, I just think we've got a proposal, it's real, it's on the table. Let's get the voice done. As our Deputy Chair is here, Mr Warren Williams said, let's get the referendum done, let's get the voice done in terms of that question of should we delay it. In terms of delaying it, things have been delayed in Australia for 235 years.
Dean, I am keen to get your thoughts as one of the lead campaigners for the Yes case. How difficult is this sort of treaty discussion that's popped up, been over the past week? It's an idea that predates the voice. It's important for a lot of people. But is it a distraction? How worried are you about where this has gone?
I think it's a bit generous to say it's just popped up. Let's be really clear. Okay, let's just talk straight. It is nothing but a confected scare campaign by Peter Dutton. It is as simple as that. This is a straight out, old school political debate, or masquerading as a political debate, but really just using Indigenous affairs and Indigenous communities as a political football. And I think Australians are absolutely sick of that. I think that this kind of tactic is from a bygone era. In 2023, I think we expect better from the political debate in and around this. As Josie said, treaty and that question has been hiding in plain sight for decades. This isn't a great big gotcha moment that's happening right now. This is raw political gamesmanship. And as we've talked about consistently here on this panel, every time we talk about that, we take our eye off the fact that our communities are in real need of real change. And that is what the voice is about. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why someone would want to not talk about the fact that the status quo is just not good enough, whether it's health, education, housing and jobs, or any other issue that the Closing the Gap reports show that we are consistently badly failing on. The action is needed is now. And that is what's in front of us. That is the beauty of what we have in front of us. That is the strength of this campaign that we have right now. We have an opportunity to put a very strong constitutional amendment that gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a voice, that allows us to hone in on those issues and to hold some of these politicians to account for their ongoing failure over the years. And I say that not as a criticism necessarily, because there has been a lot of goodwill and good intentions trying to get at some of these issues. But the thing that's been missing is the opportunity for our own people to be involved, to take our own responsibility for these issues and be at the table, being part of the solution. That is what we are voting on this year. Nothing else. Everything else is a distraction and a diversion. We are voting on a voice because we want to see real change in our communities.
Did anyone else want to weigh in on that particular issue? No. From the sounds of it, and Kenny, keen for your thoughts on this, the idea of treaty might be a longer term thing, that the voice is going to be able to deliver a more urgent response and benefit in terms of fixing some of these close the gap issues.
Well, yeah, that's the idea about the quick and practical change to close the gap. But you know that saying, when it rains it pours. Well, we've had 2 centuries of drought, and it's like the rain's finally here. We've got voice, treaty and truth. We've got a Prime Minister and government and leadership that's prepared to commit to this, and it's like we're that generation that's never seen rain, where we should be celebrating this, but we're thinking the sky's going to fall in. So whether we like it or not, they're all happening at the moment. Voice, treaty, truth. Thank God, finally. And the reality is, we'll have a voice or not before the end of Christmas.
So you're all obviously, from various perspectives, doing all you can for a successful referendum vote. But when you look at where things are at, I'm just keen to get a sense from each of you is what you would say to this audience and all Australians who may support a yes vote. What still needs to happen that hasn't happened? Is everything just going to be fine and it'll get over the line, or would you be urging some sort of change in the approach, to give this the push, the momentum that it's going to need? Chloe, to you first. What would be your advice to the room?
Look, I think you can be confident that the Yes 23 campaign will leave no stone unturned. This is happening now. It's quite literally a matter of months. So it's something that we take very, very seriously. I think that we need to be clear that the facts are the facts. We consistently see that over 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support this. It is supported, and it's also supported from, all Australians from all walks of life, whether it's, the corporate space, athletes, religious groups, faith groups. This is something that Australians want to see, and I am very confident that this will get over the line and we will see a successful yes vote later this year.
Yeah, Karen, do you want to offer any free advice to people wondering how they might be able to convince someone who's undecided, or what would you like to see?
So I think it's continuing these conversations. And while those of us here and those of us that have been doing and having these conversations for 10 years feel like we're going around in circles, there is still so many Australians out there who are undecided and for all sorts of different reasons don't have this front of mind. So reaching out and continuing to have those conversations. And what gives me hope and makes me feel very confident about this is Australians are generally generous, that we are pragmatic and practical, and what's being offered here is pragmatic and practical, and it is an opportunity for us to be thinking in a positive way of how we can actually make a difference and how all Australians can be part of that. And so keep having those conversations, reach out to those different audiences, reach out to friends, family, neighbours, because this is the grassroots conversations and the grassroots campaign that is going to win this.
Josie, in terms of that message, and the cost of living is a big problem and a big issue and a big concern for a lot of people right now, and there's this argument that, the Voice is an obsession or a distraction and far more interested in cost of living. What would you say as to why this matters to not just people here at Garma, but to other Australians who may not be focused on this?
Well, let's talk about the cost of living for remote communities. Let's talk about the cost of living where a loaf of bread costs $9, where the fuel is twice as much. So cost of living is an issue for all Australians. It's also an issue for remote Aboriginal communities. So just to make that point. What was the question?
Well, how do you convince people?
I've forgotten now because you got me worked up about cost of living.
For Australians who might not necessarily be that focused on this issue, who might not have paid much attention.
Yes.
And might be worried about their own cost of living problems.
Okay, well,
why should they? How do you reach them and convince them that this really matters to them as well?
Well, can I just say, trust the cultural authority and the leadership of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders like Yunupingu, who've dealt with government and prime ministers over a lifetime. Trust the cultural authority and the leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who deal with government, who deal with trying to unwind policy. The Voice is about influencing policy at the beginning, not at the end. I work in policy. I know what it's like dealing with the Commonwealth and the anti-government on policies that need to be changed, that are creating harm for remote communities. And across the political divide, I've worked with governments of all colours and persuasions. So trust in the Aboriginal leadership and the cultural authority who's saying, based on our experience, our expertise, our dealings with government, trying to solve difficult problems, trying to come up with solutions. Our leadership has been at the forefront of doing that. Some of those in the No campaign they don't have that same experience. It's ideological, it's political. For the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership, it's about profoundly changing people's lives. So please, it's a multiplier effect. Talk to friends and family far and wide, echoing what Karen said. And also, don't get caught up in the cloud of complexity that the No campaign is deliberately creating.
Yeah, Kenny, can I just get your thoughts on the message people should be taking home, should be delivering in their communities? And are you comfortable about where the Yes campaign is at the moment?
I am, and I've spoken to a lot of people through this campaign process, and sorry, I lost my train of thought.
What's the message people should take home to their communities?
So this is very much a shared responsibility. This isn't only about closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's not only about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is a nation building opportunity for all of us, including the economic benefits that come from a voice and system that improves the situation that we're in now. And that means it's a shared responsibility for all of us as well to be part of the conversations, because the day after the referendum it's going to be too late, and we want people to be, who aren't across this at the moment, to understand how important this is for all of us and for the future of our young people. It's going to make a huge difference to how we're seen from outside of this country as well, but just to the way we relate to each other as Australians. And we can be so proud when we are all part of a new identity that will come from this and the work that we'll build on the platform of a successful referendum.
I might take a couple of questions from the floor if we have a microphone. Thank you, that'd be great. If you've got a question, stick your hand up and we'll get a microphone too. You probably have time for 2 or 3. But just while we do that, we do have a microphone, don't we? Yes, we do, thank you. Dean, when will the vote be? Come on, come on. That pause there tells me everything.
You got to ask the gentleman in the next building. Look, we've always thought that there's a realistic window in the middle of October for this vote, and that's where we've been aiming all of our efforts. I think it's really important for people to understand this is obviously a national campaign. It's the largest campaign this country's ever seen, and of course there are things like volunteer efforts and advertising and all of that stuff that goes on, but it's actually a very simple equation, and the number is 2. If the millions of Australians that are supportive and want to see a yes vote talk to 2 people who are undecided or unaware of this issue and bring them across to yes, we win. I'll just say that again. It boils down very simply. If you support this, you want to see this get up, and you want to be part of this movement, you want to accept the invitation, 2 people in your families, in your communities, in your workplaces that are undecided or unsure, and you talk to them and very simply bring them across to yes, we will win this referendum. That's the equation in front of all Australians. So as others have said, Chloe mentioned before, we've got more than 20,000 volunteers across the country. Really importantly, more than half of those people that have signed up have never campaigned before. They're not political parties or unions or anything like that. This is their first campaign. Australians are signing up, they're getting involved. There's more than 200 Community for Yes groups across the country. You can find them at yes23.com.au. Find them, there's plenty around your area. They're very active, like-minded folk getting involved in this campaign. I really encourage you to sign up. But don't overcomplicate this. You don't need any more invitations. You don't need anybody else to come up to you and say it's okay to campaign. Now is the time to get out there and have those conversations, because we do that with millions of Australians across the country. We will win.
Yes, so question down the front. It should be on. Try that one.
Hello. Hello? Yep. First of all, can I just collectively thank the fight spirit of the panel for what you've been doing. It's really good. And we're all with you. The campaign, the fight against it, seems to be about a lot of questions about what ifs. Can I throw a what if at you that's a little left of field and say, and you alluded to it, 235 years ago, if that what if it had been answered, what would be Australia be looking like right now?
Well, that's a good question. Let's, Josie, you want to?
The question was to you, Josie.
Anybody?
What was the question again?
It's a great hypothetical. What would Australia look like, just to paraphrase, if 235 years ago the voice had been in the Constitution? Well, there wasn't a Constitution. Anyway,
I'll jump in because I had to collect my thoughts. Well, we would still have land ownership, wouldn't we? We'd have national land rights because we would own our own land that was stolen. So that's one answer to your question.
I think, it's a very interesting question. Maybe when after the referendum campaign I got a little bit more headspace, I'll put a bit more thought to it. But I think there's something about what I see people tapping into now, particularly around this question of recognition, that would be very different. And the recognition part is so important to this. As I said, the voice is the recognition, but the idea that we do recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, of course, have a 65,000-year unbroken connection to this country. And that is the thing that makes this country genuinely unique in the world. We're not the only country that's a democracy. We're not the only country that's been colonised by European power. We're not the only country with notions of mateship or have gone off to fight in foreign wars or have nice beaches. Other countries have those things too. But we are the only country that's home to the oldest continuous culture on earth. And that what it means to be genuinely, uniquely Australian is to be able to connect each of our stories to 65,000 years of culture that is thriving here today. So that sense of the Indigenous story enriching and enlivening the sense of what it means to be genuinely, uniquely Australian in the world. We might be a little bit further along the path if we started 235 years ago, but we've got an opportunity to take a substantial step later on this year.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other, should we try and squeeze in? Does anybody have a burning question, great opportunity? We got a couple of minutes. One right up the back there, just next to the post. Thank you.
I would be a leader, a role model, and a heart full of what will happen to our nation of Australia. I may be known as Miss Nobody right here, but I thank all the panels, and this is what the missing part is. When listening to the conversation, it erupts from the depths of this soil that our ancient of culture is on the rise now, reminding every Australian to turn forward. In this referendum of changing of referendum changes in the face of many Australians, nationalities, and in all walks of life is an opportunity that we should not miss. Not miss in its ways that the ancient of cultures and its wisdom is on the fire. Arising with that ancient of words of this culture, wisdom, and the land is erupting because of our response, what will be a referendum ever known in this country for a lifetime, in my lifetime, but in the lifetime as we build on this referendum knowledge and wisdom to the younger generation. It is a beautiful way, and I will say to you, It is beautiful. Everyone needs to experience this beautiness. Everyone needs to hand in hand balance your world into my world, and I will balance my world into your world. This is all about this referendum and paving the way for the future generations of every Australian. Thank you.